In the last video, you learned how to lay out and size child components using absolute X and Y positions, as well as relative percentage settings on both the parent and child components. In this video, you will learn how to implement constraint-based layouts, where child components lay themselves out relative to pixel values set on anchor positions in the parent container. To position and size components using constraint-based layout, you must place the components inside of a Spark container with the layout property set to an instance of the basic layout class. You can also use constraint-based layout inside of MX containers, but since the equivalent containers exist in Spark, you should use the Spark containers whenever possible. Previously, with the basic layout class, you have specified X and Y properties for components in order to position them absolutely in the display. For constraint-based layouts, you do not use X and Y properties. Instead, you use baseline, top, bottom, left, right, horizontal center, and vertical center. Each property takes a pixel value which determines the distance that the component will be positioned relative to the specified constraint for the parent container. Before I get back to the employee portal example that I was working with in the last video, let me illustrate the implementation of constraint-based layouts using design mode. Here is an MXML application without any visual controls. Note, however, that it does have a layout property set to basic layout. I'm switching to design mode and then dragging a panel container to the design area. When I save the application and run it, you can see that the panel container looks the same as it did in design mode. Back in design mode, I'm scrolling down in the properties view to the size and position section. These checkboxes represent the constraint properties that I outlined earlier. I'm clicking on the left constraint and setting a value of 50 pixels. I'm doing the same for the right, top, and bottom constraints. When I save the file and run the application, as I resize the browser, you can see that the panel always stays 50 pixels from each of the four edges. Back in Flash Builder, I am switching to source mode to show you the left, right, top, and bottom properties set to 50 pixels. I'm removing these properties and replacing them with the horizontal center property set to 0 and the vertical center property set to 0. When I save the file and run the application, the panel returns to its default size, but it is positioned exactly 0 pixels from the horizontal and vertical center of the application. As I resize the application, it maintains its centralized position. This is the employee portal application as I left it at the end of the last video. Note that the right edge of the Company Picnic panel sits against the right edge of the browser. I want to add some white space to the right of the panel container, but I still want the container to scale as the browser resizes. Remember that these three columns of content are inside of an H group container, so it's this parent container that controls their position in the browser. I'm adding a right property to the H group container with a value of 20 pixels. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that there is a forced margin on the right that is 20 pixels wide. But note that there is now no white space on the left for a nice margin. I'm adding a left property to the age group container with the value of 20 pixels. When I save the file and run the application again, you see a nice 20 pixel margin on each side of the 3-column display. Next, I want to apply vertical constraints so that this last panel container will fill more of the vertical space and maintain that relative growth as the browser resizes. I'm adding a bottom property to the age group container with a value of 20 pixels. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the age group container is still the same height, so it moves to the bottom of the browser to maintain the 20 pixel margin at the bottom here. As I resize, you can see that the age group continues moving down the page. Back in the code, I'm adding a top property with the value of 90 pixels. Note that this is the same value as the Y property, which I can now remove. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the application looks as it did before. The monthly event component still isn't constrained to the bottom of the browser window. In this case, you cannot apply a bottom constraint to the monthly events component. Remember that a child is constrained to the properties of its parent container. In this case, its parent is the age group container, which implements a horizontal layout property. You must have a basic layout property to implement constraint-based layout. In this case, I will need to use percentage layout. I'm adding a height property with the value of 95% to the monthly events component. I am also opening this component and adding a height property with a value of 100% to the text area control. When I save the files and run the application, you can see that this approximates my goal. The last element I want to constrain is the date. I want it to line up 20 pixels from the right edge of the browser, but I also want to maintain its left edge here near the employee portal text. Here's the label control that contains the date display. I'm adding a right property to it with a value of 20 pixels. However, when I save the file and run it, you can see that the label control moves to the right, but that it does not maintain its left position. I am removing the width property and replacing the X property with a left constraint. When I save the file and run the application again, you can see that the date displays and resizes as I change the browser width. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Creating a Scalable UI.